A single second can feel like an infinity when it carries the weight of a life-changing choice and deep emotion. We capture those eternal moments and turn them into cinematic art for your viewing pleasure. Hit subscribe now and explore the infinite nature of the human story with us. The summer I turned 63, I finished the last piece of hand-cut crown molding in what I believed was the most beautiful room I had ever built. I stood back, sawdust still in my hair, and I cried. Not because I was sad, because I was done. Because every knot in every plank of that old barn had become something I understood, the way a man understands his own heartbeat by feel, not by thought. I wiped my face on my sleeve and called my son to tell him it was ready. He did not answer. He called back 2 days later. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I am not a man who asks for much. I spent 38 years working as a Finnish carpenter in western North Carolina, framing houses, laying hardwood floors, building cabinets that outlasted the marriages of the people who ordered them. My hands have been cracked and bleeding more mornings than I can count. My knees have been bad since my early 50s. I drove the same pickup truck for 19 years because it still ran, and I saw no reason to spend money I did not have on something I did not need. My wife, Carol, used to say I was the most stubborn, economical man she had ever loved. She said it like a compliment, and I took it like one. Carol passed 7 years ago. Breast cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and I will not say more about that because it still sits in my chest like a stone I have learned to carry but never to put down. What I will say is that after she was gone, I needed something to do with my hands. Grief is funny that way. It either makes you still or it makes you move. I have always been a man who moves. The property had been in my family since my grandfather's time. 42 acres outside a small town called Flat Creek, about 20 minutes east of Asheville. Nothing fancy. A farmhouse we used as a weekend place when Connor was a boy, an old equipment barn that had not been used for actual equipment since the 1980s, a creek that ran cold and clear along the back property line, and a ridge view that faced west and turned orange and purple every evening like something painted by a man who was showing off. The barn was a 2-story post and beam structure, white oak frame, probably built around 1940. The roof had leaked in 2 places. The siding was weathered gray. Inside it smelled like old hay and machine oil and time. Most people would have looked at it and seen something to tear down. I looked at it and saw a home. I started the project 18 months after Carol died. I told Connor what I was doing. He was living in Charlotte then, working in commercial real estate, married to Madison for about 3 years. They had just had their first child, my grandson, Eli. I told Connor I wanted to convert the barn into a real living space, something he and Madison and the kids could use on weekends, a place to bring the family, the kind of place his mother always talked about having one day. Connor said that sounded great, Dad. He said it the way young people say things when they are not really listening. I heard it in his voice, but I did not say anything because I believed that once he saw it, he would understand. I worked on that barn for 4 years. I am not exaggerating when I say 4 years. I am not compressing the timeline to make a better story. From the spring of the year after Carol died to the late summer 4 years later, I drove out to Flat Creek every weekend, and most of my vacation days, and every day after I retired in year 3 of the project, and I worked. I replaced the roof myself with metal standing seam, the real stuff, dark bronze, the kind that lasts 100 years. I repointed the stone foundation. I insulated the walls with spray foam and covered them with reclaimed shiplap from 3 different demolished farmhouses I sourced through salvage contacts I had built up over decades in the trade. The floors on the main level I laid in longleaf pine, old-growth heart pine, the kind of wood you cannot buy new because the trees that produced it are mostly gone. I found it through an estate sale in Rutherford County, a man who had stockpiled it in the 1990s and never used it. 1,200 square feet of flooring that glowed amber under finish like something lit from inside. I built the kitchen cabinets myself. Cherry wood, hand-fitted dovetail drawers, no plywood boxes, solid wood throughout. I built a dining table from a single slab of black walnut I had been aging in my shop for 11 years. waiting for the right project. The slab was 8 feet long and nearly 4 feet wide, one piece, with a natural live edge on both sides. I put hairpin legs on it, and it looked like something you would see in an architecture magazine. I built a loft bedroom above the main space, accessible by a floating staircase with open risers and a cable railing. The master bathroom on the lower level had a soaking tub I framed in with cedar planks and a walk-in shower with a river rock floor. I set by hand, stone by stone, over 4 weekends. I put in a front porch that ran the full width of the building, facing west, toward that ridge view. I built cedar rocking chairs for it, 4 of them. The same pattern Carol had always admired in a magazine she kept in a basket by her reading chair. I did 90% of the work myself. I hired an electrician and a plumber for the systems because I am stubborn, not reckless. Everything else was my hands, my tools, my hours. When it was done, I walked through it slowly, alone, the evening before I called Connor. The last light was coming through the west windows in long horizontal bars, catching the pine floors and turning them gold. The walnut table sat in the middle of the main room, and it was the most beautiful piece of furniture I had ever made. The rocking chairs on the porch were still and perfect. I could hear the creak from the bedroom window. I thought about Carol. I thought about how she would have sat on that porch every evening with her tea and her book, and how she would have made it feel like home in 3 days the way she always did, and how the grandkids would have run to the creek and come back with muddy boots, and she would have been happy about it. I stood there until it got dark. Then I locked up and drove home and called my son. He and Madison drove up from Charlotte on a Saturday. 3 weeks later, they brought Eli, who was 4, and their new baby girl, my granddaughter Nora, who was 6 months old. I met them in the driveway of the old farmhouse, and we drove the gravel road back to the barn together. I watched Connor's face when he got out of the car. He looked at the building for a long moment. He nodded slowly. He said, "It looks clean, Dad. That's really something." I had expected more, but I told myself he needed to see the inside. Madison was already walking around to the back, looking at the exterior, and she said, "Is the siding original? It just looks really weathered." I told her it was reclaimed, that it was intentional, that it was part of the aesthetic. She said, and then she looked at Connor. Inside was worse. Not because anything was wrong, everything was right. It was worse because I could see it was not what they had imagined. Or more precisely, it was not what they wanted to imagine. Madison walked through the kitchen and touched one of the cabinet doors and said, "It's beautiful craftsmanship, but is there a panel-ready option? Like, for appliances?" Because I really prefer an integrated look. I did not know what panel-ready meant in the context of a barn I had just finished spending 4 years of my life on. Connor stood at the walnut table and said, "Dad, I want to be honest with you. I know you worked incredibly hard on this, but Madison and I have been talking, and honestly, the vibe in here is very rustic, like very cabiny, and we're really more of a modern, minimalist household. I mean, look at our place in Charlotte." I said, "I built this for you." He said, "I know, and I appreciate that. I really do. But it's not really our style." I did not say anything. I was standing next to the walnut table, my hand on the surface of it, feeling the grain under my palm. Madison said, "Honestly, Walt." She always called me Walt. And I had never asked her to, what if we just sold this property? Both structures, the farmhouse and this building? You could take the money and do something nice for yourself. A condo, maybe? Somewhere easy to maintain? I said. A condo. She said, "I'm just saying it might be more practical at your age." My age. I was 63 years old. I had just built, with my own 2 hands, a structure that would stand for 100 years. A structure more honestly made than anything Madison had ever decorated with her preferred integrated appliances and modern minimalist aesthetic. Connor said, "The thing is, the land might be worth something to a developer. There's been a lot of interest in this area. I've been watching the comps in my work. We could probably get good money for the acreage."
I said. We, he said. Well, you know what I mean. I said, I do. Connor took Eli down to the creek that afternoon while I sat on the porch in one of the cedar rocking chairs and held baby Nora and watched the ridge go orange. Madison was inside on her phone. When Connor came back up from the creek, Eli was soaked to his knees and laughing, and Connor was carrying him on his back and laughing too. And for a moment I saw my son the way I used to see him. 7 years old, running through the yard, full of something uncomplicated and good. Then he came up on the porch and his face went back to the face it had been. He said, "We don't have to decide anything today." I said, "That's right, we don't." They drove back to Charlotte that evening. I sat on the porch until the stars came out, which in that part of the mountains happens suddenly, all at once, like someone throwing a switch. I rocked in Carol's chair, and I thought about what my son had said. I thought about the word rustic as he had used it. I thought about Madison asking if there was a panel-ready option in a kitchen I had built from scratch with hand-cut joinery. I thought about a condo somewhere easy to maintain. I stayed at the property that night. I made coffee in the kitchen on the cast-iron percolator I kept at the barn, and I sat at the walnut table in the dark, and I thought for a long time. In the morning, I drove into town and made a phone call to a woman named Diane Holt, who was a real estate agent I had known for 20 years through various clients. I told her I might be thinking about selling the barn property. Just the barn structure and about 5 acres surrounding it, separated from the main farmhouse parcel. I asked her what she thought it might be worth. She drove out the following week. She walked through the building for 45 minutes without saying much. She opened cabinets. She crouched down and looked at the floor joints. She went up to the loft and looked at the cable railing and the view from the loft window. She stood on the porch for a long time. She said, "Walter, I need to be direct with you." I told her direct was the only kind of talk I had time for at my age. She said, "This is not a barn conversion. This is a high-end luxury property. The materials alone, the longleaf pine flooring, the walnut slab, the cherry cabinetry, the metal roof, if I priced out the materials today at current salvage and premium wood pricing, we're talking about a materials cost that most spec builders never see on a similar square footage. And your craftsmanship is not contractor grade. This is artisan work." I asked her what she thought I could get for it. She sat down at the walnut table and put her hands flat on it and looked at me. She said, "There's a market right now for what people are calling experiential real estate. Short-term rental properties, wedding venues, corporate retreat spaces, boutique accommodation. This property, with this ridge view, this creek access, this level of finish, within 20 minutes of Asheville?" She paused. "I would list it at 1.4. I think we sell at or above asking." I said, $1.4 million. She said, "At minimum." I did not say anything for a moment. I looked at the walnut table. I thought about Connor telling me it was not their style. I told Diane to draw up the listing. I did not tell Connor. I want to be clear about why. The property was mine. My grandfather's land. Passed to my father. Passed to me. My name alone on the deed. Carol and I had agreed early in our marriage that the family land stayed in my name because her family had complicated feelings about inheritance, and we wanted to keep things simple. I had never signed any portion of it over to Connor. He had no legal claim to any of it. I was not obligated to tell him anything. But more than that, and I want to be honest about this, I did not tell him because some part of me wanted him to find out the way he found out. Not out of cruelty, out of the belief that some lessons have to land hard to land at all. Diane listed the property on a Thursday. By the following Monday, we had 11 inquiries. By Wednesday, we had 4 showing requests, 2 from private buyers and 2 from development groups. I agreed to 3 showings. The first was a couple from Atlanta who were looking for a vacation property and saw it as a personal residence. The second was a boutique hospitality group based in Nashville that was developing a collection of luxury short-term rental properties under a single brand across the Southeast. The third was a private buyer from Asheville who was a retired architect. The Nashville group made an offer on the 6th day after listing. Full asking price, $1.4 million, 30-day close, No contingencies except inspection. Their representative, a man in his late 30s named Thomas, told me over the phone that their acquisitions team had described the property as the finest example of authentic American vernacular architecture they had encountered in 3 years of searching the Appalachian region. He said the walnut table alone had generated what he called genuine excitement internally. I told him I wanted to keep the walnut table. He said he understood completely, and they would subtract a reasonable value from the purchase price for the exclusion. I said, "You know what? Leave it. It belongs there." We closed in 31 days. The morning of the closing, I drove out to the property one last time before I went to the title company. I sat on the porch in one of the cedar rocking chairs which were included in the sale, all 4 of them, and I looked at the ridge. It was October by then, and the trees on the ridge were in full color, red and orange and gold, the kind of display that makes people drive hours just to see it from the road. I sat there for about an hour. I thought about every board I had put in that building. I thought about the 11 years that walnut slab had spent drying in my shop. I thought about Carol saying she wanted a place on the ridge someday. I thought about Eli soaked to his knees in the creek, laughing. I did not feel regret. I felt something closer to completion. Connor called me the day after the deed transferred. I do not know how he found out. Asheville is not a big world, and he had colleagues who worked in the region, and I suppose property transfers are public record. He called me at 6:40 in the morning, which told me he had not slept. He said, "Dad, did you sell the barn property?" I said I did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Without telling me?" I said, "It was my property, Connor. My name on the deed. Always has been." He said, "But I thought we talked about that being for the family." I said, "I built that barn for the family. You told me it wasn't your style." He went quiet again. I said, "You told Madison it might be worth something to a developer. I agreed with you." He said, "Dad, how much did you sell it for?" I told him. He did not speak for a long time. I could hear him breathing. I could hear Madison's voice somewhere in the background, asking him something, and I could hear him tell her to give him a minute. He said, $1.4 million. I said, "We accepted full asking price." He said, "Dad, that land has been in our family." I said, "My family, my grandfather, my father, me." He said, "I can't believe you did this without even..." I said, "Connor, I spent 4 years building that space for you and your family. I put my hands and my health and what was left of my grief over your mother into every board in that building. You drove up one afternoon and told me it wasn't your style and asked if I had considered a condo." He was quiet. I said, "You made your decision about that property on that porch. I made mine." He said he wanted to talk to a lawyer. He said he believed he had a claim as a family heir. I told him to talk to whoever he needed to talk to. I told him I had already spoken to my own attorney before the sale, precisely because I had anticipated this conversation, and that the deed transfer was clean and uncontestable. I told him I wished him luck. He hung up. Madison called an hour later. I did not answer. She called twice more that day. I did not answer either time. I want to tell you about what I did with the money, because it is the part of this story that matters most to me. I kept enough to live on comfortably for the rest of my life. I am not an extravagant man. End of. A.T. I do not want a boat, or a sports car, or a second home in Florida. I want my shop and my tools and my pickup truck and the 42 acres out at Flat Creek where the farmhouse still stands and the creek still runs cold. I set up a college trust fund for Eli and Nora, equal shares, irrevocable, with a third-party trustee, $400,000, split between them. They cannot touch it until they are 18, and it can only be used for education or a first home purchase. Connor and Madison have no control over it and no access to it. It is for my grandchildren, directly and only. I donated a significant amount to the vocational carpentry program at the community college in Asheville, the same program that gave me my first real training when I was 19 years old, and my father had no money for a 4-year school, and I had hands that were better with wood than with textbooks. I gave them enough to fund full scholarships for 6 students a year for 10 years. I requested that the scholarship be named after Carol. The rest I put in a simple index account, and I try not to think about it. Connor and I did not speak for 4 months. I am not going to pretend that did not hurt. He is my son. He is the person Carol and I made together and raised and loved through every stage of becoming who he is, including the parts of who he is that I do not always recognize or understand. I missed him during those 4 months the way you miss a room in a house you used to live in, not with rage, but with a dull, quiet ache. He called me in February. On a Sunday morning. He asked if he could come up to the farmhouse. I said yes. He came alone. Madison stayed home with the kids, which I thought was the right call for everyone involved. He sat at my kitchen table, the old one, ordinary, nothing special, and he drank my coffee, and he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "I'm listening." He said, "I don't think I understood what that barn meant to you. I don't think I understood what you put into it. I came up there and I looked at it like a piece of real estate. And I said things that were dismissive and hurtful. And I'm sorry." I said, "I know you didn't understand. That was part of the problem." He said, "I understand it now. Thomas, the man who bought the property, he's published about it on their brand's website." I read it. He described the joinery work and the materials and what it took to source the longleaf pine, and he described the walnut table. He said it was the kind of craftsmanship that almost no longer exists in residential construction. He said his guests drive hours to stay there specifically because it was built by hand. I said, "Your mother always knew." Connor looked at his coffee. He said, "I know." I said, "She would sit on a porch for an hour without saying a word and feel completely at home. I built that porch for her." He said, "I know, Dad. We sat there a while. I am not the kind of man who rushes a silence when a silence is doing something useful." I told him about the trust fund for Eli and Nora. He was surprised, and then something in his face softened in a way I had not seen in a long time. He asked why I hadn't told him sooner. I said because I wanted him to sit at this table first. He nodded. Before he left, he asked if he could bring the kids up to the farmhouse for Easter. I said of course. I said I had been thinking about building a small workshop behind the farmhouse. Nothing fancy, just a clean space with good light, and that when Eli was a little older I might teach him some basic joinery if the boy showed any interest. Connor smiled at that. He said, "He might surprise you." I said, "They usually do. I still drive out to Flat Creek most weekends. The farmhouse is modest and comfortable, and it smells like old wood, and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in places where people have lived simply for a long time. The creek is the same creek it has always been. The ridge is the same ridge. In the evenings I sit on the farmhouse porch in a plain wooden chair. Nothing special. And I watch the colors change. I have heard from Diane that the Nashville group has booked the barn property nearly every weekend through the following year. Weddings mostly, and some corporate retreats. Thomas sent me a photograph a few months after the sale. It was the walnut table set for a wedding dinner. 16 people, candlelight, the ridge visible through the west windows in the background. The table looked exactly the way it looked the evening I finished it. I put the photograph in the frame that used to hold a picture of Carol and me at the beach, the summer before she got sick. I moved that photograph to my bedside table. I put Thomas's photograph on the kitchen windowsill of the farmhouse, because I wanted to see it with morning light coming through. Carol would have understood all of it. She would have understood the barn and the sale and the long silence with Connor and the reconciliation and the trust fund for the grandkids. She would have understood why I kept working through the grief instead of letting it make me still. She would have understood why, when my son looked at the most careful work of my hands and called it a style mismatch, I did not argue or plead. She would have said, "Walter, a man who knows what he made doesn't need anyone else to tell him what it's worth." She was right. She was usually right. Last Easter, Eli spent most of the afternoon in my shop watching me work on a small step stool I was making for Nora. He is 5 now, almost 6. And he has his father's eyes and his grandmother's curiosity. He stood at my elbow and asked me the name of every tool he saw. He asked why I was cutting the joint at an angle. He asked if he could sand something. I gave him a piece of scrap cherry and showed him which direction to move with the grain, and he sanded that scrap piece for 20 minutes with the concentration of a man doing important work. When we went inside for dinner, he carried the scrap piece in with him and showed it to his mother and said, "I made this." She looked at me over his head, and I saw something in her face I had not seen before, something that might have been respect, or might have been something softer than that. Connor put his hand on Eli's shoulder and said, "Grandpa taught you that." Eli looked up at him and said, "He said I can learn to make a box next time." I said, "If you want to." He said he wanted to. I looked out the farmhouse window at the ridge and the last of the evening light catching the upper tree line, and I thought about the stone foundation and the longleaf pine floor and the black walnut table where strangers were probably sitting right now, eating a good meal, looking at the same view I had looked at my entire life. Some things hold their value no matter who tells you they don't. That is something a man learns with his hands before he learns it anywhere else.